Welcome, friends of Japanese prints. I'm Dieter Vanschura, manager and owner of the Artelino company. We sell Japanese prints in weekly online auctions, artelino.com, and we produce these videos about Japanese prints. Today's subject is a little bit tricky. I want to talk about Sankin Kotai and the influence that Sankin Kotai had on the production of Japanese prints of the 19th and 18th century. Sankin Kotai, I am sure you never heard about it, is normal. Sankin Kotai, the literal translation, that means alternate residence in Japan. And it was a system to keep Japanese feudal lords from waging war against the central government of the shogun in Edo. The local lords, the feudal lords, also called daimyo, they were obliged to keep a permanent residence in Edo, the capital. And there, either the daimyo himself had to stay for half a year, later it was a little bit prolonged, or his wife and his eldest son, the heir. So always the feudal lord himself, or the most important persons next to him, his wife or his eldest son, had to be in the capital Edo. This was a luxurious hostage system, nothing else, And it was in effect from 1635 until 1862. So for roughly 230 years, it was introduced by the shogun Tokugawa, the Tokugawa shogun Iemitsu in 1635. And now it comes, it had worked. During this period, there was peace. There was no more war in Japan. Imagine that. Let's take a closer look at it. I mean, how did it come that this system could be taken into effect at all? So we have to look at the history of the 16th and 15th century. That was the period of the so-called warring states, or Sengoku period. For 150 years, local lords, the daimyo, feudal lords, they fought for the supremacy in Japan and fought against each other, fought to extend their power. And finally, one of them, Tokugawa Ieyasu, from the Tokugawa clan, he got the upper hand in the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. And by and by, this system called Sankin Kotai, permanent residence, was introduced to preserve peace. And it was not only, the system was tricky. It was not only taking the daimyos or his family as hostage, it was also to keep them weak by putting immense burdens, financial burdens on them. They couldn't just rent a hotel room in Edo, They were obliged to keep a lavish residence in the capital with a huge staff of several hundred servants, including samurai, and they had to organize their move every 6 months from their local residence to Edo, and the other way, in a huge procession of several hundred people, on an average 150 to 300 people, but also processions of more than 1,000 people were not unusual, and these processions had to take place with all whistles and bells. Historians estimate that this system of Sankin Kotai that took 25% of the revenue of a local lord, of a daimyo, just with the costs for this system of keeping these double residences and these processions. The system of Sankin Kotai had a huge effect, of course, on the economy and on culture. Let's pick out the most important one, road building. The most famous of these medieval roads, which were used for these processions, was the Tokaido. You see it here, famous Tokaido series by Ando Hiroshige. Well, here is one example. It's by Ando Hiroshige, and this shows such a feudal processions. You see there hundreds, whistles and bells, and it was a very formal procession and very, very costly. All these guys, it took them weeks to travel, and they had to be accommodated, they had to be fed, and they had to keep a certain standard, of course, yeah. Well, there was one effect, road building. They had to, not only the roads, then they built these stations. You must imagine these stations along these roads, along the Tokaido. The Tokaido was the most famous of these roads. They were like today's rest areas along our highways in the US or in Europe. And now comes the second effect. Now imagine there were thousands of people in Edo, the capital, 10,000s, yeah. Idle people, but wealthy people, servants, samurai, the noblemen themselves, and they had nothing to do. But they had a certain wealth, yeah? So this was a perfect ground for an entertainment industry. Entertainment in those days, that were the kabuki theaters mainly, yeah? The tea houses, the restaurants, and the so-called licensed quarters with the so-called courtesans, prostitution, in clear words. And that all thrived. And of course, this was a nourishing ground for handicraft, for commerce and handicraft, and especially for bookmaking. And bookmaking, that was ukiyo-e, making prints, ukiyo-e, and making books. That was the same technique. It was all woodblock printmaking. And that got a huge boost. It flourished, especially the kabuki theaters. Most of the ukiyo-e were made for the kabuki theaters, showed the popular actors, the kabuki actors, kabuki programs, all that was made in the form of ukiyo-e. And well, these prints depicted this floating world of entertainment. To give you an impression what huge effect this had and what dimensions. The system was abolished in 1862, and then all these local lords, they demolished their residences, they moved home. And historians, they guess that within 6 months, around 1862, within half a year, the population of Edo was cut into half. Imagine, cut into half. And estimates are that at that time, Edo had, before the abolishment of this Sankin Kotai system, Edo had roughly 1 million inhabitants. That means half of the population, 500,000, left Edo within half a year. I can hardly believe it, but this is what I read in reliable publications. So you can imagine the impact that this Sankin Kotai system had on ukiyo-e, on the prints that we enjoy today. We would hardly ever have such huge numbers of prints and such a huge amount of different designs. Kunisada alone, who had specialized in kabuki prints, well, he's estimated to have created 20,000 different designs during his lifetimes. And ukiyo-e, let's not forget that. That was commercial art, that was a commercial business, that was pop art, that was Andy Warhol, that was Roy Lichtenstein, yeah? That was the same philosophy. Pop art is the same philosophy as the old ukiyo-e of the 19th and 18th century. Well, books today about ukiyo-e are often, nearly always written in a very highbrow, intellectual, scholarly manner, or by people who studied literature or arts or humanity. In my view, the influence of the economy is completely neglected in these books, and that's wrong. Yeah, and especially in our times, the influence of the economy on arts is huge, believe me. Let me conclude by showing you a few of these prints that show these feudal processions. And these prints are mostly from the Meiji period. That means they were not created while the system of Sankin Kotai was still in effect. Why? During that period, it was censorship. It was disallowed to show anything about the ruling Tokugawa shogun family or anything about actual events, and also anything about the Sengoku period. So all the prints that we can see today with these feudal processions, they were mostly from the Meiji period. Well, this is a little bit an exception here by Ando Hiroshige. That is another one by Hiroshige III, a Meiji artist, was active towards the end of the 19th century. And well, this shows such a procession. That is the Nihonbashi, the Nihon Bridge in Edo, the starting point or the end point, depending on which direction you come. And another very important artist, Chikanobu Toyohara, he made wonderful prints, mainly in the form of triptychs, showing these feudal processions. Yeah, look at that one, gorgeous. Yeah, and look, I mean, how long it is, hundreds of people. Another one, that is typical for the late Chikanobu. Well, lovely. We are already applied some Western techniques, different from the early Edo prints, completely, but wonderful. Well, so much about this crazy system of Sankin Kotai. Thanks for your patience. It was a long video today, and I would be pleased to see you again in our next video. And of course, we are always pleased to see you in our auctions, artelino.com of Japanese prints. Thank you, and take care of yourself.